Okay, recording.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this YorRobots seminar on this mostly sunny afternoon in York. Anyway, mostly sunny afternoon. I'd like to introduce Professor Emma Hart from Edinburgh Napier University in Scotland. So Emma has been one of the leading researchers in computational intelligence for many years, and over the last, I'm not sure now how many, Emma, maybe 10 years or so, she's focused that quite a lot on robotics. And application to robotics. So today she's going to talk, as the slide says there, talking about towards an autonomous evolution of robotic ecosystems. And I suspect she will talk generically to start with, and then focus in on a specific project that she's involved, and it involves a number of universities, it says down the bottom there. But you've come along to listen to Emma, not me, so I'm not going to say any more. So I'll pass across to you, Emma.
Thanks, Andy. So yeah, I'm going to talk about generally about evolutionary robotics, and obviously particularly about this project that I'm collaborating on with, led by Andy at York and a number of other universities. So I know some of you in the audience will obviously know something about this, but I think the audience is broader. So I'm going to try and take a kind of broad perspective on this work, and not go into too many technical details, but try and talk about some of the challenges that have come up during this project and some of the ways that we address them. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear to all of us that robots are a kind of part of everyday life now, whether, particularly in the workplace, whether that's in hospitals or factories or warehouses such as Amazon, or even now at home with these kind of home cleaning devices. So one thing that all of these robots that you might see around you today have in common is that they're obviously all designed by human engineers, and they're designed to do a very specific task in a very specific environment that the human engineer has full knowledge about. So, even in an Amazon factory where, of course, like lots of unexpected things might happen, as a human, we can kind of envisage what those things might be and design the robots in order to work well for this given task in a given environment, which is fine. But what if we want to evolve? What if we want to create robots that work in environments that we know nothing about? So what if we want to send a robot to a faraway planet to do some exploration, or even closer to home, put it inside a nuclear reactor to do some cleanup in a place that a human can't go? So we're not entirely sure the task that the robot might need to do when it gets to this new environment. We're not really sure what the environment is like in terms of its physical characteristics. So how can we, as a human, design a robot that's going to be right for these completely unknown environments? And this is really what I want to talk about, is this autonomous design of a robot in cases where we can't use our human knowledge to do it in the way that we normally would here on Earth. So what I'm going to talk about is using evolution to do it. Why evolution? So I know this might be familiar to some people in the audience. Well, if we look at the natural world around us, evolution is pretty good at designing things that exist and work well in specific environments, particular niches that they happen to find themselves. So for example, here's just two examples. The thing that you see on the left is a plant that occurs in a Cuban rainforest, and it's evolved these leaves that look like mini satellite dishes. And what it's really useful for is when bats are echolocating, the sound bounces off these satellite dishes, and then it encourages the bats to come and pollinate off the flowers. It actually happens at the expense of making it slightly less good at photosynthesis, but it turns out it's a really good trade-off for this particular plant. So evolution has come up with this physical design that allows the plant to work best. The thing on the right is an okapi, which has numerous physical adaptations that allow it to survive well. It has scent glands on its feet that allow it to kind of mark its territory. It has these markings that allow it to be camouflaged. It has a skin that's kind of water repellent. It has an enormous tongue that enables it to lick its ears for some reason that turns out to be evolutionary advantageous. So nature is really good at designing physical things that are very well adapted to the environment. So the question is then, can we somehow encapsulate this inside a machine to use an artificial evolutionary mechanism to design robots that are very good for some environment that we know nothing about? And the answer is, it seems like a reasonable idea, because actually, just to put a little bit of history here, if you go right back to the start of artificial evolution, so this is right back in the 1960s, where some German engineering students actually first had the idea of applying an artificial evolutionary mechanism to design this plate that you see in the picture there. So this was design of a physical object by an evolutionary process, and it made the news right back then in 1964, this article that translates as zigzagging to Darwin. So it was really like the first example of using artificial evolution at all, and it was evolved to create a physical object. So these students went on to do some more interesting things. So for example, the thing you see there is evolving it's a two-phase gas nozzle. You're trying to maximize the airflow through the gas pipe. And what's really interesting here is not only could they optimize this through the use of evolution, the shape of the pipe that emerges is kind of really interesting. It's not something that a human might have designed. So it kind of just gives the point that the evolution can design things, artificial evolution can design things that can be both optimal, but also creative, that it might kind of find ways to do things that we might not have considered as humans. But of course, evolution then was much more difficult. So this actually shows the photographs of these students actually in the lab trying to test out these evolutionary designs, and they had to physically make these things, welding pieces of metal together to figure them out. Of course, we've got much more tools at our disposal now, which makes evolution a lot easier for us. So obviously right at the beginning, this toolbox that allows us to kind of create artificial evolutionary mechanisms was pretty empty. We had some pretty basic computers. Right at the beginning of artificial evolutionary algorithms, there was some theory that basically suggested that if you represented things as bit strings, it gave you some indication of the likelihood of you evolving a good solution. Now, these are pretty basic tools if you want to start using evolution to design robots. Fortunately, here we are in 2021 in a much better place where our knowledge of evolution, artificial evolution, and the tools that help us do that has really vastly increased. So obviously we have much more powerful computers with powerful CPU, GPU. We have excellent simulators that really can take advantage of this improvement in hardware to really be able to give us very realistic simulations in kind of close to real time of a lot of things. We also have some big advances in evolutionary theory, so particularly encodings that just don't rely on bit strings, but allow us to use kind of mechanisms that I'll explain a bit later in the talk that allow us to kind of generate designs. And this turns out to be really useful for robotics in particular. Evolution, or artificial evolution, also has some things that it's disposable, like rather than it now has like a bunch of different materials. So if we want to use it to evolve robots, we don't just have to make them out of plastic, we can make them out of flexible soft materials that you can pass current through, that can kind of flex and change their stiffness. You can even make it out of wood or paper. So the set of materials that are available to build robots has changed. And we also have, of course, huge advances in engineering that enable us to prototype robots very fast in the real world using 3D printing. And again, 3D printing is not just restricted to printing plastics, it can produce all kinds of things these days. And of course, advances in automation that allow us to actually assemble robots from 3D printed parts and any additional things that we need. So given all these tools at our disposal, it's now becoming much more clear that it seems like a realistic thing that we can try and harness all these things together and try and use it to evolve robots in these situations that we don't know anything about. So the idea is not new. It's been used to, evolution has been used to design many things. If we look back over the years, moving on from 1964. If you're interested in this design of things, there's a nice paper by one of the collaborators on our project, Gus Iben, in Nature that you might look to. Here's just a couple of examples of real things that have been designed by evolution. So what you see on the left is a satellite, is an antenna that went on a satellite designed by NASA and actually went up to space in 2006. So this is an evolutionary algorithm designed object that's actually in space. The thing you see on the right is some work that was done by somebody in conjunction with Honda, and it's design of a car wing mirror. And they're designing it for all kinds of aerodynamic properties as well as strength and things like that. So it's really just to illustrate that artificial evolution has been used to evolve quite complex things over recent years. But what I want to get into is that there's a big difference between evolving passive things that don't move, like this antenna to go on the satellite, where you have to evolve the shape, but then you just kind of use it as is, and evolving something like a robot that has many moving parts. So it has actuation that allows it to move in different ways. It has sensors, so it might have cameras or sensors to sense infrared or heat or anything else. It has a very defined physical shape. And so once you start to think about all of these things, it becomes much more complicated to figure out, well, how can we apply evolution? Because we're not just trying to evolve the shape, like not just the shape of this six-legged robot you see here, but we're also trying to evolve how does that shape interact with its environment by sensing the environment around it and feeding that back into some kind of brain or control mechanism that allows it to actuate and move and actually do something useful in its environment. So it becomes really a whole different ball game where we're trying to evolve these robots, because they're not just physical objects, they have a body, but they also have a brain. And that's really what differentiates them from some of the previous work that's gone on. So what we really have to think about now is how are we going to co-evolve or jointly evolve both the morphology, the shape of the robot, and what defines its shape in terms of how it's actuated, whether it has legs or wheels or a mixture of the two, but also its brain and how its brain interacts with what the robot is sensing about the world, and how those sensors, that information is turned into signals that are sent to the moving parts of the robot. And this becomes much more tricky. There's a very nice book that discusses this by Pfeiffer and Bongard from 2006, which is called How the Body Shapes the Way We Think. And what they discuss is that we often just think about intelligence in terms of being something that the brain has, okay? But actually what they argue is intelligence can actually be distributed across both the body and the brain. And actually you can, if you have kind of smart evolution, by evolving a smart body, you can kind of remove some of the need for complexity of a very complex brain. So there's this kind of balance for the evolutionary process of kind of figuring out how much effort into designing a good morphology and how much effort is required to design a good brain. And if you can get that balance right, it becomes easier to do both. You can have a less complex brain by having a very well-designed body. But to do that, you've got to do both of these things together. You can't just design a body and then try and apply evolution to design the best brain for the body. You have to do both things together in order to try and let evolution decide where the balance lies between how much intelligence is in the body and how much intelligence is in the brain and the control mechanism. So this is really the challenge for any project where you want to try and evolve robots, is this co-evolution of body and brain at the same time. So I thought I would just give you, before getting onto the project, give you a little bit of a history of where evolution, artificial evolution, is at in terms of co-evolution on body and brain, because it's not a new thing. In fact, it probably goes back to about 2000, where we see one of the first examples of researchers trying to co-evolve robots in terms of co-evolving the body and brain. So what you see here is if I can just make these little videos work, is they evolve in simulation, these very simple robots. So they're made from kind of these tubes that can join together, and they can be actuated at a joint. So they use evolution in simulation that you see in the top picture to evolve a robot that's good for a particular task. And then after it's been evolved, they pick the best one and they create it by hand. And now here you can see the real physical robot, which is a pretty good replication of the simulated robot. So it kind of proves it works in practice. It does co-evolve the body and the control mechanism, but this robot doesn't have any sensors, so it's unable to figure out to know what's going on in its environment. It can only actuate and move through its environment. So jumping forward a bit, so I said a bit earlier that artificial evolution has kind of had a bit of a kickstart from advances in new materials. So this is some researchers, again, from Lipson's lab, who are trying to take advantage of these flexible materials that you can actuate them by changing their stiffness. So again, they use an evolutionary algorithm to evolve in simulation these robots, and you can see this working here. And what basically you pass some current through, and it makes the material flex, and it allows the robot or the evolutionary process to find a process that allows the robot to move. And just like I showed you before, what they do is they do this in simulation, and then afterwards they build the robot by hand, because it's actually, or at the time they did this, it's hard to actually create this actuated flexing materials. They actually kind of used a proxy for this by putting it in a pressure chamber, and you can change the pressure, and that provides the change in pressure that allows the materials to contract and expand. But again, there's no sensing here. The robot is capable of actuation, which is definitely a step forward, but it can't, again, sense any information from its surroundings. Okay, so another example of that is in the modular robotics community. So this is actually RoboGen. It's a kit that you can actually buy. You can download the simulator and buy the parts. Follows very much the same model in that you evolve a body and a controller in simulation. And then once you've found the best possible robot in simulation, you post-simulation build the robot. So again, this doesn't tend to have any sensing capabilities, and also because of the modular nature of the construction, where basically you have a set of fixed shape building blocks at your disposal, it's somewhat limiting in the kind of robots that might kind of appear. So for example, you tend to get things that look like snakes or things with branches like trees, because they're basically built out of cubes where you have to connect parts to one of the sides of the cubes. So there's some kind of limit to the overall scope in the types of robot that you might get here. So one thing that is in common with everything that you see here is in all of the cases that I've just showed you, you apply artificial evolution to evolve a robot in simulation. And then once you found the best thing, you build by hand the robot and you test it to see how it works. Here's another actual example of that. So this is more recent work, and this is actually a big step forward in robotics, and it's pretty cool, I think. So again, this is from Bongard's lab in the States. Again, they're evolving the body and controller in software, but the big leap forward here is after they've evolved in software, they hand build the robots, but they hand build them using living stem cells from frogs. And so this is an example, if you like, of the world's first living robot. So let me just show you this, if I can make it work. Yeah, so what you see here is the simulation. So they're evolving these kind of voxel-like robots that kind of actuate like some of the ones I just showed you by kind of flexing. So evolution is used to find a good robot to do a task, but then they, in the lab, actually build these robots out of living stem cells that are taken from frogs. So what you see there is the in silico and in vivo versions. So the bottom version is speeded up, but what you can see, it's a pretty good replication of what you saw in simulation. So this is very interesting work that Hart might, obviously this is a kind of nano scale, and they suggest that it has some applications in kind of nanorobotics in future, for example, in drug delivery inside the body. And they do a bunch of tests to show that actually, quite surprisingly, these hand-built living things exhibit pretty much the same behaviors as what you see in simulation. And they do it for lots of configurations and build them afterwards. So it's very interesting work. You can find it in lots of the national newspapers and on YouTube. Just to show you an example there. So here's one that's evolved to actually kind of scoop up material. So you can see the simulation. Here's one for pushing, and you can see that the simulation and the in vivo ones work pretty similarly. Okay, I'm going to just stop that there. So again, hand built following evolution, but using living cells, which is definitely interesting. But again, no sensors and modular in the sense that all of the components used to build the robot are identical. So even though I just said that actually surprisingly in the living cells case, the robots had pretty good performance when they were built compared to what you saw in simulation. What we generally see, and anybody that's been working in robotics of any kind will know this, that generally when you do something, build a robot in simulation, and then you transfer it to the real environment, it very rarely behaves in exactly the same way that you expected in simulation. And you can do a lot of things here by like adding noise to the simulation, doing some evaluations in the physical system. But it's a kind of very well-known problem in robotics, and one that's really hard to get around unless we have simulators that are absolutely 100% perfect replication of the real world. So this really leads me on to what this project is about, is like, can we kind of change this by saying, instead of trying to address an issue, which is how do we make our simulations better so that things that evolved in simulation work well in the real world, can we just do evolution directly in the real world? Because then we're going to remove this reality gap altogether. So it's a big question. There has been a little bit of work in this area. And just before I get on to talk about the project, I just wanted to briefly talk about some of this. So this is some work from a lab in Cambridge where they basically have the same idea, to ditch the simulation and do everything directly in hardware without a human in the loop. So they work in a kind of modular system, a little bit like one of the examples I showed you previously, where robots are built out of these blocks, and the small things are actuators. It doesn't have sensors. So they basically have an artificial genome that basically says how what modules are needed, how they should be constructed, in what form, and what control the robot should have. So let me show you a video of this working. So what you see here is basically there's a computer that's kind of doing the evolution. It comes up with a design, and then this arm builds the robot. And it's a little bit hard to see on the video, but it squirts out some glue, you'll see there. And then the blocks are glued together in the pattern defined by the genome. It picks up some of these actuated blocks and does the same kind of thing of gluing those together. And then when the robot has been built, it's picked up, and then it's moved into an arena for kind of testing. And they use what they call a mother robot. It's essentially a camera that basically observes the behavior of the robot, assigns, so you see it fell off the table there, assigns it a fitness score, feeds that behavior score back to the evolutionary algorithm, and it designs a new generation of robots. So there is no human in the loop here. The evolution is done 100% in the physical system. But again, it's limiting in the fact that, again, there's no sensing and by the modular design of these robots. So that brings me now directly to ARE, the project that I want to spend the rest of the time talking about. So like I said, the idea here is really to try and evolve robots in real time and real space in something that looks like this kind of cartoon version of what we're hoping to achieve, is where you have some sort of fabrication system that designs and builds robots. Once a robot is built, it's transferred to some kind of training facility. You can think of it a bit like a kindergarten or a nursery, where the robot kind of refines its motor skills. It's a little bit like a child kind of, waving its arms around and sort of tuning its motor skills so it can walk and run and jump. So robots are kind of put through a sort of training period in this facility, and then they're let out into the real world where they conduct some task. Their fitness is fed back into the evolutionary algorithm, and that drives a kind of reproductive cycle of new robots. And ideally, we would have some kind of recycling feature so we can kind of take apart old robots and recycle their parts into new robots. So this is the overall vision, where you could, you know, in the far future, imagine putting this on a box, sending it all to a planet, and letting this system evolve the right robot for that planet, for that environment that we don't know anything about. So this is the grand vision. I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the challenges and the ways we've tried to address some of the challenges in taking some steps towards achieving this. So the project's had quite a lot of press and interest in the media. There's a couple of articles there you might want to look at, which is great, but I'm going to come back towards the end about why this also has a little bit of a downside when we come to talk about the ethics of this whole thing. So just to kind of go through this in a little bit more detail. So we're creating this thing that we call the kind of evosphere, where we have this evolutionary cycle, where the first step is to have artificial evolution create some sort of genome that defines both the body and the brain of a new robot. So that blueprint, if you like, is sent to our fabrication system. It actually produces this new physical robot. This physical robot is then sent to this test facility where it undergoes some period of training to allow it to refine its motor control. It probably undergoes some kind of test. Like if it turns out that it can't move at all, there's not much point in wasting time progressing with that robot, so we can just discard it. If it passes that test, then it's added to this kind of pool of robots that might be already out there in this world that we're trying to evolve in, where it gets to execute a task, and its performance on that task is basically used to drive a reproductive cycle about what robots get reproduced in the future. So this is the kind of grand picture. I'm just going to talk about some of the steps in a little bit more detail. So those of you at York, some of you might have seen this hidden away in one of the electrical engineering labs. So this is one of the first versions of our robot factory. So what you see here is a 3D printer on the right, which is printing out the skeleton, the body of the robot, according to a design that's been produced by the Evolution. What you see on the left is a kind of store of components. It's like a warehouse that has things like wheels, joints, sensors. And the idea is that the blueprint can basically indicate which of these are to be used. And then these can be used in the assembly process to build the final robot. And then, of course, what you have in the middle is this assembly arm. And so this assembly arm will basically, once the skeleton has been printed, attach the components that are needed to the skeleton, which includes the brain of the robot, and download the software into the brain of that robot. So I'll show you a video of it working shortly, but just to talk about some of the other components. So what's controlling all of this is what we call an ecosystem manager. So I've talked a lot about how it's really important to do this inside a physical system, because that's how we solve the reality gap. But it kind of also makes sense that if we can simulate, we might as well do some simulation in parallel, because simulation is much faster. And even if the simulation isn't 100% authentic, it might help at least inform what's going on in the physical world. So what we're creating is essentially two parallel worlds: a physical simulator, where a physical world where everything is happening directly in real robots, and a twin of that physical world where things are evolving in simulation and much faster, but possibly not as authentically. But what this does, it kind of raises some interesting possibilities for evolution, is that what we can do is we can take something that evolved purely in the virtual world, and we can send it to the real world where it can be built and hopefully tuned to work better in the real world. So that kind of tries to address the reality gap. We can do it the other way around though. We can take things that are good in the physical world and we can send them to the simulator. And hopefully this improves what's happening in the simulator, because we're sending robots that we know are good in the physical world to the simulator, and hopefully they will pass on some of their characteristics to these virtual robots. And we can do something that's not a thing that you see in biological evolution, is we can have this, like what we call crossbreeding, is where we can actually kind of have some hybridization, where we take, let's say, a mother robot from the virtual world and a father robot from the physical world, and we can mix their genes together and get something that's kind of hopefully the best of both worlds. So we have this ecosystem manager that manages this process that does this hybridized reproduction. And we can also use information from the physical world to kind of send that back to the simulator to improve the simulator itself. For example, refining the kind of parameters of the simulator that control gravity or friction. So the ecosystem manager, which could be a human, it could be a machine, or it's most likely going to be a mixture of both, does multiple things. It can also determine like which robots should we build. So for example, it can examine a population of robots and select the ones that we think, you know, a bit like a human breeder would breed plants, for example. And you select things that you know have good traits and you try and mix them together. So a human robot breeder could essentially have some control of this process by influencing which robots get to breed. It can monitor the reality gap. It can also do things like monitor the resources. So for example, if we're running out of wheels or plastic, it needs to influence the evolution not to produce robots that need more wheels or more plastic. So there's a number of kind of algorithmic things it can do. And this also includes things like changing the parameters of the evolutionary process itself. So for example, evolutionary algorithms have a whole host of parameters associated with them. The manager could update those. It can update the simulation like I just managed, and it could update various other things about the process. So I will talk briefly about some of the engineering aspects. I will direct you to my colleagues in York if you want more technical details about that, because they work much more on this side than me. So we've put a lot of work into making it easy to be able to build these robots. So it's pretty straightforward to print skeletons, although there are some things that I'll discuss in a minute about that. But in order to make this assembly process easier of attaching wheels, joints, sensors, wiring up the robot, we've put a huge amount of work into devising these components to make them as simple as possible for this automated assembly arm to be able to do that. So for example, you'll see that the sensor is encapsulated in this kind of plastic box that has a clip that makes it really easy to attach to the skeleton. The skeleton has a kind of matching clip that allows it to attach on really easily. It's got space to put a cable in. It's got some space to allow the gripper on the assembly arm that actually holds it to actually pick it up and put it together. So it kind of sounds like a trivial thing as just to design some components, but actually there's been a lot of iterations to get these to be really a design that really facilitates easy assembly of them. So what you see here is their virtual representations and the physical representations. So even trivial things like, right, one thing that proved really difficult is when we were cabling up the robots, that the wires were all getting really tangled up with each other as the arm was kind of moving in and out. And this was solved by using these retracting cables that with hindsight seems like an obvious thing, but isn't something that you notice until you actually see the problem happening in reality. So lots of work has been put into developing these physical components to facilitate evolution. This is the brain. It's obviously an important part of the robot. It's a Raspberry Pi. It's been built so it's easy to charge. It's got a camera attached to it and lots of sockets to attach other things, and designed again so it securely fits onto this skeleton base that we're attaching them to. So a lot of engineering in here. Here is just an example of the fabricator in motion. It's obviously speeded up. So you can see there's a skeleton that's been printed. The brain is put in first, and then this isn't actually in one of the prior versions. It's hung up to make it easier to attach the components. So you can see here the arm attaching the wheels. I'm just going to skip it forward a bit just to show you. So this is actually one of the earlier iterations, and I can just so you can see the problem with this cabling is that when you start to try and plug these cables in, you can see immediately how they all start to dangle down and get in the way of each other. So this has now been solved by using these retracting cables. So not trivial to get to this stage by any means. So let me talk briefly about the algorithm design parts as well. So one thing that actually I wanted to comment on that really makes this kind of evolution different than biological evolution is if we look at biological evolution, there is some evidence in evolutionary history that like within a genus, so for example, within big cats, you get some kind of interbreeding. For example, there's some evidence that lions and jaguars interbred at some point in the past. So you do see this kind of breeding within a kind of similar species. But what we never see in real evolution is this kind of breeding where you get things that are actuated by completely different means, breeding together to produce something by like this thing that I found on the wonderful internet, the snowy owlpud, that's obviously a mixture of a snow leopard and an owl. So we just don't see this happening in real evolution. But in robot evolution, this is exactly what we want to see happening, because we want to, for example, take a robot that walks on legs and one that works on wheels and create some robot that is exactly a hybrid of the two, that maybe has, 2 legs and 2 wheels, because that might allow it to work in multiple different situations. So we really want to be able to do this interspecies breeding. And the hardest thing about it is actually not creating something that has a hybrid of the physical characteristics, but it's dealing with the brain part, because the brains that allow these 2 different robots to move are very different. The kind of brain that takes in information and controls legs is very different than the brain that takes in information about 2 wheels and controls them. So we have this real issue that if we want to kind of hybridize 2 very different robots, while their physical structure might turn out to be okay, it's really difficult to inherit a brain that is going to work in this new robot, because the 2 brains are just so different. So this is one of the big challenges that we've had to address. So I want to very briefly talk in what looks like a complicated diagram about some of the ways that we've been doing this. So we do this by a mixture of evolution and learning, and I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the different ways that we can combine these. So the first way is a mechanism that basically focuses only on evolution to jointly optimize the body and the brain. And to get around this problem that I just said, that if you take 2 things that are really different and you create a child robot from them, it's very unlikely that the brain will work at all. Okay, so what we do to get around this is, instead of trying to directly inherit brains and merge them together, we use what we call an indirect mechanism, which instead of specifying what the robot looks like, it specifies a mechanism by which you generate the robot. And it also specifies a mechanism by which you generate a brain. So what's evolving here is the generating mechanism, not directly the shape or the brain. So we use something called a CPPN. It stands for a compositional pattern producing network. I'll show you an example in a second. And in fact, we use 2 CPPNs.
I think we lost her.
For the minute, yeah, looks like it.
She might come back very soon.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, cool. Okay, so I don't know where I was. I think what I was saying is you put the coordinates of the space into this network, and it outputs at each coordinate what material or component and orientation of that should be. So basically we what you see here is we do one pass through the network. It's just shown in 2D of all the coordinates, and it first tells us where we should put skeleton material. Then we do another pass where we say, okay, for all of the positions on the surface of the skeleton, what should be attached there? Nothing, or a sensor or a wheel. And then we finally resolve that into a robot that has a certain number of sensors and wheels. And we use exactly the same type of network to create the neural network. So once we know the shape of the robot, we can create a network. And what the CPPN does here is we pass in now, instead of the coordinates, we pass in pairs of coordinates of neurons, and it outputs the weights and the biases for each of those pairs of neurons. So what we're evolving is these two networks you see on the top row, which are mechanisms to generate robots that allow us to address this problem of the brain body mismatch. So an additional thing that we can do is, so what I just showed you on the previous slide allows us to generate a neural network that controls the brain of the robot. But what we can do is actually try and improve that generated network during this kind of learning process in this kindergarten nursery that I talked about before. So we can take the weights and we can apply additional learning algorithm to try and improve the weights of the generated network. And this kind of fine tunes the network specifically to the body of the newborn robot. So learning definitely kind of adds some knowledge and improvements there. Another thing we can do is try and simplify the process, and instead of trying to co-evolve the body and the brain, we let the evolutionary part evolve the body. And once we've produced a body, so we know how many sensors and actuators it's got, then we just generate a neural network controller to match that with the right topology. And then we use a learning algorithm to learn the weights for that generated controller that exactly matches the topology. So that simplifies things a little bit, but basically it puts some of the emphasis onto the learning mechanism rather than the evolutionary mechanism. And in some cases, we can kind of write this learned controller back to the genetic material. A way to improve this is to, every time we come across let's call it a species of robot. So for example, one that's got one wheel and two legs, we can call that a species, or another species is defined by one with one wheel and one leg. Every time we come across a new robot for a certain species, we can keep the controller that we learned from it. And if we come across a new robot of the same species, well, we can start learning from the previously learned controller. So this allows us to kind of bootstrap this learning process a bit by keeping this collection of controllers in an archive that kind of maps to species of robot. And we use that to bootstrap the learning. And again, this has been shown to have some advantages in speeding up learning, but it also has some interesting knock-on effects in that it kind of influences the evolution and the diversity and the type of robots that you get that are evolved. So some other idiosyncrasies that I wanted to talk about of robot evolution that you don't get if you just work in standard evolutionary algorithms, let's call them. So the first thing here is that when we evolve these robots, we need to be able to make them using this fabricator that I showed you. So whereas in a simulator, you can produce a robot where, for example, you've got two sensors right next to each other, and the simulator doesn't care too much about kind of collisions between them. You can't do that in real life. They have to have like distinct locations in space. Another challenging thing is, even if there's no collisions in the positioning, you have to actually be able to build this robot. So if what you see here in the gray is the robot arm, and it's trying to insert a wheel, but it actually needs some space to be able to kind of get at the place on the robot where it needs to be able to attach the wheel. So you can't have evolution come up with a design of the robot that can't actually be manufactured by the system that we've created. So we have to take these things into constraint. So rather than giving evolution free rein, we needed to constrain it to making buildable robots. Another thing is in the design of the skeleton, it's kind of seems pretty obvious that you can't print overhanging material on a 3D printer because obviously it would just drip down. So you need to take that into account in constraining the evolutionary process to only produce skeletons that can be made by a 3D printer. So we have to add on all of these additional things to make our system work that are kind of new in the context of evolutionary computing. None of these things matter in simulation, but they make a real difference for us. Also, we want these robots to be viable. There's no point evolution coming up with something that doesn't have any way of moving or no real mechanism for sensing the world. So what we do to try and influence is quite often start off by, rather than most evolutionary algorithms start off with a random population, but instead we try and seed the population with a set of robots that are manufacturable. Okay, but also because evolution relies on having a diverse population, it's really the diversity that makes evolution work. We also need to make sure that that seeded population is also diverse enough. So we do this with a thing called Novelty Search that mainly been led by Edgar at York. So it's a form of evolution, but rather than selecting based on performance and using that to kind of influence the sort of survival of the fittest, you select based on novelty. So what is novelty? It's basically some descriptor that you have to define that says this robot is different or novel in some sense compared to another set of robots. So we've looked at what you have to do here then is define this descriptor, and then you measure novelty with respect to your descriptor by looking at your kind of nearest neighbors in the space and saying how different am I from them. And what we can see here is just some examples of Edgar's work where he showed that how you choose this descriptor really influences the type of robots that you get. So you can see, for example, the middle descriptor produces quite different looking robots from the ones that we see on the top. But you can also see that all of these descriptors create novelty. So we can see within each block, you get a bunch of different robots. And that's really important to allow the evolution to work. I briefly just wanted to touch about ethics before I finish up. So I mentioned those newspaper articles, but they also generated some more newspaper articles, which didn't really send the message that we're trying to create, let's say, in this project. But actually, I think it's, it reflects how it's easy to misinterpret what we're trying to do, and why, of course, if you're creating a system where things can design and manufacture themselves, there is a serious point that you do actually need to think about how you ensure that that the system remains in control and that a human has oversight of it. So it's something that is always I guess at the back of our minds for the project. Of course, the easy answer is there's a big red off switch that you just shut the entire production facility down, because if you can't make robots, then they can't reproduce. Okay, so that is a kind of simple answer to it. A kind of more nuanced version is that I talked a little bit earlier about this ecosystem manager most likely having a human in the loop who has some control, or so you can imagine them sitting with a dashboard that allows them to see what's going on, and they can control what's going on. Another way of controlling it is basically to limit the supply of raw materials. So, if you're building these robots out of plastic and you run out of plastic, then you can't build any more robots. So there are various things that we can think about, and I've talked about them very quickly, but it's just really to make the point that it is something that has to underpin this work as well. So I just wanted to kind of finish up by saying, I've talked about this in the terms of how do we make robots for environments that we know nothing about. But you could also turn it on its head and think about, well, actually what this is giving us is a tool that allows evolution to happen in real time, in real space, but not in biology, but in a population of plastic robots at the moment. So you could possibly see our technology as like a research instrument to study evolution itself. So just like we have telescopes to study the stars or a cyclotron to study particle physics, maybe some reproducing, evolving robot facility like this will allow us to actually study some things about evolution itself. And actually the point was made a long time ago by John Maynard Smith, the famous biologist, who said, we only have one system to study evolution with at the moment, and until we get interstellar flight, we aren't going to have another one. And this was exactly what this scientist John Long tried to do, who was looking at evolution of fish, and he actually used an artificially evolving system of robotic fish to try and answer some questions about a real biological evolution. So I'll just leave that there. Obviously, thank you to all of these people who did all of the practical work and really made this happen. And just to say, I've skimmed over a lot of the detail, and you can find all the publications that are associated with that on the York website that's associated with the project.
Thank you, Emma. That's fantastic. Well done, and good you got back again. So that was good. If you want to stop sharing the screen for a sec, I assume you're okay to take a few questions.
I'm fine. Yeah, I'm good. Yeah.
If we've got some questions, okay.